Morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Jaideep Prabhu. I'm a professor of marketing at the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge, and I'm here to talk about innovation in emerging markets like India. For most of my career, I studied innovation as it was done in the West by large corporations. But in the last few years, I've turned my gaze to emerging markets such as India, and what I've learned from there has surprised me. In contrast to Western counterparts, innovators in countries like India seem to be unique on three dimensions. First, their innovations seem to be extremely frugal. They seem very good at taking cost out of the entire innovation process. And this may be because they are faced with extreme scarcity and constraint in their environment. Second, their approach is extremely flexible. They're very good at improvising solutions. They rarely have one fixed plan that they stick to. They may switch very quickly from one plan to another, and perhaps this is in response to the highly unpredictable environment in which they operate. And finally, many of their innovations are focused on people who are excluded from the formal economy. And perhaps this is because very many people are excluded, and they offer a huge opportunity for the innovators. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Now, here on the left is what we might associate with a typical innovation in a developed, affluent society. It is a high-end fridge that will talk to you, and you can talk back to for the price of about $3,000. It's a very expensive way to store your caviar. In contrast, you're more likely to see something like this in a country like India. This is a $30 fridge. It does not need electricity. It uses the cooling properties of water and clay to keep fruit and vegetable fresh for up to 5 days. This is extremely frugal because it uses widely available resources such as clay. The approach that the innovator used to come up with this, both from the development and then the manufacturing and sales, extremely flexible and improvised. And finally, it's inclusive in that it targets literally hundreds of millions of people who would like to have a fridge but cannot afford one, or even if they could afford one, don't have electricity to run fridges on. Here's another example. This is a mid-range incubator for babies. It costs about $20,000 and may come from a company like GE. I would argue that in a country like India, you're more likely to see an innovation like this. This is a $200, not quite incubator, but a baby warmer. And it does 80% of the job that this incubator would do. And very importantly, that job is saving the lives of infants who may be born 2 weeks prematurely but are unable to maintain their body temperature, and this would help them to do it. I would argue that something like this is more likely to solve the problem of infant mortality that afflicts the lives of many hundreds of millions of people around the world. A third example. This is a very high-end gas cooking range from a French company. It costs about $50,000. In an emerging markets context, I would argue that something like this is more likely to be innovative. This is a smokeless oven which uses biomass pellets to solve the problem that, again, literally hundreds of millions of people face, which is they cook in open fire stoves with wood, which is not only bad for their health, but also very bad for the environment. In the last 4 years or so, I've talked to literally scores of innovators in India, up and down the country, large and small. And when I asked them how they would describe this frugal, flexible, inclusive approach to innovation, more often than not, they use the Hindi word Jugaad to describe this. And this is the word that we use in the title of our book. We define Jugaad as the art of overcoming harsh constraints by improvising an effective, good enough solution using limited resources. The very interesting thing that we discovered as we were researching this book is that it isn't particularly unique to India. We find this in other emerging markets, such as Brazil and in Africa and China. We also find counterparts in developed economies, such as the US and France. Now, why does a country like India need this approach? Well, the facts are somewhat brutal. Upwards of 40% of Indians live outside the formal economy. They don't have access to banking, they're off the electricity grid, and they don't have much access to good healthcare or education. Another way to think of this is that most formal solutions from the marketplace are targeted at the upper crust of people who are in the cities and belong to the formal economy. And while they form quite a large number of people, there are much larger numbers of people who are outside that formal economy, in urban slums, in smaller towns, and in the vast countryside. And those people have not typically been seen as a market, but they offer now a huge opportunity for companies. Now, India, in a sense, is a microcosm for the world, and the World Resources Institute estimates that the people who earn less than $9 a day, purchasing power parity, are 4 billion, which is more than half the world's population. These are people outside the formal economy around the world. And together, they offer a huge market opportunity that has been hitherto untapped. Together, they form something like a $5 trillion market, which, to give you a sense of how large that is, it's about the size of the entire Chinese economy, or 3 times the size of the Indian economy. So a huge untapped market opportunity. Now, what about the West? Would the affluent West benefit potentially from something like this approach? Well, you mentioned earlier the figure of R&D spending, which we've seen in the US and Western Europe continue to escalate over time. But in fact, the returns for this are increasingly diminishing. Not just that, but we also see that household incomes have been falling, and that households and increasingly governments are cash constrained. In a situation like that, it's possible that frugal, flexible, inclusive innovation coming out of emerging markets is particularly attractive. Let me turn to talking about some of the people behind these ideas. Here is the person behind that clay fridge I mentioned. His name is Mansukh Prajapati. He's from a village in Gujarat. He has a high school education. And he came up with this idea actually in response to a major catastrophe in Gujarat, which was earthquakes. And his ambition is not only to sell this to people in India, but elsewhere. Here's another kind of social entrepreneur in India who does this kind of innovation. This is Dr. Mohan. He's a diabetes specialist operating out of Chennai, a big city in South India. He has many patients, unfortunately, in the city, but he also recognizes there are many people who suffer from diabetes in the countryside, and they do not have access to good quality healthcare. These people in the village would have to go to the city to receive healthcare. Equally, his doctors from the city cannot go to the village. They have many things to do in the city. So he came up with this frugal, flexible solution, which is a mobile diabetes clinic, which was donated to him by the World Diabetes Foundation. Inside this mobile van is sophisticated equipment which patients from the village will look into. The image of the iris is beamed through the satellite to the doctor sitting in the city who can make an instant diagnosis, which is then communicated to this person who is a health volunteer from the village. And that person then takes care of the patient following the visit of the van. It's very interesting that Dr. Mohan doesn't pay people like that. He selects them and trains them, but for them this is a way to improve their employability. So it's a very frugal, flexible, and inclusive solution. Here's another social entrepreneur from the city of Bangalore, Harish Hande. He studied engineering, and his objective was to prove that poor people could use and maintain affordable energy solutions such as solar lighting solutions. But he quickly realized that it was very expensive, particularly for people in the countryside, to afford the upfront costs. A fruit cart vendor told him that 300 rupees a month was too much, but 10 rupees a day wasn't. And he realized that the poor, whether urban or rural, earned and spent on a daily basis. They typically bought kerosene for 15 rupees a day, and he would have to offer a solution at the same price in the same way. So he came up with the following business model. He selects and trains people like that from the local community. Then he works with a bank to get people like that a bank loan because they are not banked. With the bank loan, this person then sets up shop, gets the solar panels and batteries, charges the batteries during the day, and rents them out at 10 rupees a pop in the evening to end consumers. And this is how he has reached now over 200,000 households with his solar lighting solutions. Now, there are ingenious solutions like this that social entrepreneurs are coming up with. They're often very suited to the local environment and really meet the needs of their customers. The one problem, though, is that they find it very hard to scale up and reach large numbers. This is where large companies can come in, and there are examples of large companies now entering the space, domestic companies such as Tata's. This, the world's cheapest car, the Nano, is probably an example of such a frugal innovation intended to bring on board people who currently cannot afford a car but would like them, coming out of a country like India. The Tatas have stuck with this in other types of businesses that they operate in. The next nano-type frugal innovation they came up with was this water filter, the Swatch water filter, which retails for a price of about 1,000 rupees, which is about half the price of the next cheapest unit that comes out from, say, a company like Unilever. The Indian government isn't typically known for innovation, but recently they've been backing innovation, particularly in areas such as education. And this is the Minister of Education who's backed this very cheap tablet, $35, which they intend to roll out in schools across the country, government schools, where children would like to learn, but often the teachers don't show up. There's a big problem of teacher absenteeism, and they're hoping that this, combined with high-speed broadband, will enable kids in remote areas to learn through distance learning. Multinationals that have been operating in countries like India for a while, companies that set up very large R&D centers in the mid-90s onwards to tap into the large numbers of scientists and engineers there, have recently turned their attention to doing this kind of innovation in countries like India. GE has their largest R&D center outside the US in Bangalore, and in their R&D center recently they came up with this frugal, flexible innovation, an ECG machine, Mac 400, designed to reach 70% of the population that lives outside the cities and do not have access to the current generation of very expensive, large, sophisticated machines that sit in city hospitals. How did they come up with this device? They copied some of their domestic Indian and Chinese competitors who would do this kind of Jugaad innovation. They realized that they would need a printer for this ECG machine. So they looked around and found off-the-shelf bus ticket printers that they could use. Then they needed keypads, and they found they could use telephone technology for that purpose. So they cut and paste existing off-the-shelf solutions, applied a quality standard, and produced something that was 1/10 of the cost, 1/5 of the weight, battery operated, and could be taken by doctors out into the countryside. This is done well in India, it's done well in China. It now has FDA approval and is selling well in Western Europe and North America. Another example of this kind of frugal innovation was introduced by Nokia. Nokia's biggest markets for a long time have been in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, where they have developed products like this for people who live in urban slums. So they noticed, for instance, that people who lived in urban slums in India would pay quite a bit for the mobile phones relative to what they earned, but then would be very protected. They would immediately wrap them in plastic to protect them. They also noticed that these people would use the light in the phone to see their way in the dark at night. So the engineers at Nokia said, why don't we develop an affordable, robust phone that integrates these features into the phone? So this phone has a dust-proof keypad and front face and a built-in torch. And these two features and the fact that it's rugged and affordable has made it one of the best-selling consumer electronics goods of all time. Now, increasingly, mobile phones are pervasive, and companies are developing services on the mobile phone platform to reach people at the bottom of the pyramid. And here's one that I'm particularly fond of. It's called M-Pesa. It stands for mobile money. It was introduced by Vodafone's subsidiary in Kenya, and this is what you can do. If you have this service, you can go to a corner shop in your village, hand over cash, and get the equivalent texted back to you that you can then accept with a 4-digit PIN to sit on your phone as electronic money. You can then go to another shop, text that guy some of it, and get cash back. So you can do cash in, cash out. But if you can do that, you can also do person-to-person transfer. If you leave your family in the village and go to work in Nairobi, and there's a family crisis, you can instantaneously, at the speed of light and the cost of a text message, send money home to your family, which is much better than sending it through wire transfer and paying 15% of the amount. There are other things that you can do with it. That's one of the killer applications. Another one is this. You don't have to have a bank account, but you can go to an ATM, text some of the electronic cash to the ATM and get money back. So this helps people who are unbanked, and the very large numbers of people, and it's done very frugally. You can also do international transfers. And in the time since it was introduced, this has absolutely taken off in Kenya. The Economist estimates that recently there are something like 15 million people who use this service, and it's more than the number of people who have a bank account in a country like Kenya. Now let me end with thoughts about Jugaad in the West. Is it possible that this is happening in Western countries? Here's an example of a group of people out of Northwestern University, very much like people in the audience here. When they graduated, they said, we don't need to go to Africa or Asia to solve major problems. We have plenty in our own American backyard. For instance, they decided to look at this problem of hospital-acquired infections, which affects something like 2 million people every year, and 100,000 deaths in the US alone. a huge cost to the economy. So what did they do? They went to a local Chicago hospital. They observed doctors and nurses, and they talked to them. And they realized something very quickly. Doctors and nurses have every intention of being hygienic, but often they do not have the time to go to a wall unit to actually wash their hands. So they asked themselves, what would a kid do? A kid would probably wipe his hands on his trousers. So why don't we actually design a dispenser that actually clips onto the scrubs of doctors and nurses? They went back to their studio with basic equipment, computing, software, and a 3D printer. They came up with this device, which is called SwipeSense. It clips onto the scrubs of doctors and nurses. It also has a sensor which sends information, a signal, to a wall unit every time it's used. And in the evening, the doctor or nurse can observe their data on a screen and see how they performed, and also how they performed relative to others. This was done extremely frugally. All aspects of innovation, from doing the market research to development to marketing. They don't have big advertising budgets. They market it by doing TED Talks. Here's an example from Cambridge, a student of mine, Eben Upton, who developed this very low-cost computer, only 22 pounds sterling, meant for British school children. But you can imagine the impact this might have in emerging markets, very much like that tablet PC I mentioned earlier. So there are examples of this happening here in our backyard. This is another Cambridge company that's developed the solar lighting solution, a bit like Harish Hande's solution I mentioned earlier, for households in Africa. They're in Kenya, South Sudan, and Sierra Leone, so in very interesting places, using technology and ideas out of the West in other parts of the world. And in an example of ideas coming from developing countries into developed countries, Barclays has now introduced the equivalent of M-Pesa in London called Ping It. So what does all this mean for you? I'd argue that in conclusion that this kind of frugal, flexible, inclusive innovation is absolutely crucial, not only for large numbers of people in the emerging world, but equally in the West, in the aftermath of the financial crisis. I believe that entrepreneurs and companies in the UK and the West can gain a great deal by engaging with their counterparts in emerging parts of the world. And people like you, young people like you, can come up with products and services like the SwipeSense, like that baby warmer, which was developed by students from Stanford and now being tested and marketed in South India. I believe you can come up with these ideas not only here, but also in other parts of the world, and by doing that, together we can improve lives everywhere. Thank you.